My name is Riccardo Accaro and I'm the head of the Global Actors Program of the International Affairs Institute in Rome. I'm very glad to welcome you all to this online meeting on a topic, on an issue, the topicality of which cannot be exaggerated, I think. The relationship between the European Union and China, the evolving relationship between these two global players, a relationship that has become even more topical in light of the results of the US elections last year, given the fact that both the new administration of President Joe Biden and the European Commission itself actually have made an express commitment to seeking greater consultation and cooperation at the transatlantic level on how to deal with the many and diverse challenges emanating from the People's Republic of China. This is an issue of great topicality, as I have just said, something that we have seen confirmed very recently by the conclusion by the European Union and China of a comprehensive agreement on investment, an agreement which was very long in the making, but that was completed only in the last stage of the Trump administration, notwithstanding the fact that very important people in the incoming Biden administration had signaled that they would have liked some more preliminary consultation at the transatlantic level. So there is an express commitment on the part of both the Americans and the Europeans to talk more about how to go along with China, but there is also an objective difficulty in terms of how you can actually make that consultation work for both sides. Clearly, a central topic in the relationship between the EU and China concerns Chinese investments in Europe in particular. And in that context, it is obviously of great importance how such investments by China have been pouring into the EU, into individual EU member states in the framework of the Belt and Road Initiative, the major initiative launched by President Xi 7 years ago, almost 7 years ago, right now, or perhaps even more than 7 years ago, in 2013 anyways, and which, as you all know, is ostensibly aimed at investing in the infrastructures needed to speed up and facilitate trade between East Asia and Europe. The Belt and Roads Initiative, the state of the Belt and Road Initiative implementation in Europe is exactly the topic of our debate. More specifically, the implementation of the BRI in 4 countries in Europe: Italy, Greece, Portugal, and Poland. But I guess the discussion will not be limited to these countries only, and we will have the chance to discuss how the Belt and Road Initiative is unfolding in the EU as such. With that, I will pass on the floor to my colleague, Lorenzo Mariani, who is one of our Asia experts here at the IAEI, and who will be moderating the discussion and introducing to you all the speakers. With that, I thank you again, and I hope and wish us all a very good debate. Lorenzo, on to you.
Thank you, Riccardo. Thank you for your introduction, and welcome everyone. It is a great privilege for me today to moderate this debate. Let me introduce to you the speakers. We have Justyna Sachedlik, head of the Asia Pacific program at the Polish Institute of International Affairs. Carlos Rodriguez, coordinator of the Center for the Asian Study at the University of Aveiro. Plamen Tonchev, head of the Asia unit at the Institute of International Economic Relations. And last but not least, my colleague and friend, Francesca Ghiretti from IAI. So before starting our discussion, let me just say that we will proceed in the following order. We will start with Justina, then Carlos, Plamen, and Francesca. A quick reminder for the speakers, you will have, each of you will have 10 minutes, up to 10 minutes for your presentation. I encourage you to stay within this limit so that we will have some time for the Q&A session. And also a side note for the audience, at the bottom of your screen, you can find, you should see a Q&A button, or in Italian, DR. If you tap there, there's a chat and you can submit there your question. At the end of all presentation, I will open a Q&A session, and I will read, unfortunately, just a selection of your questions. So this is it. These are the rules of the game. If Justina, if you're ready, I'm gonna leave the floor to you.
Thank you, Lorenzo. Good afternoon, all of you. And I would like to express my gratitude for the invitation to be part of this event to Francesca, Riccardo, and Lorenzo. I'm also very happy that our colleagues, Carlos and Plamen, are co-speakers of this panel. As it was mentioned by Riccardo and Lorenzo, that today's topic is about EU and the BRI and Chinese investment under the BRI framework. And I was invited to this seminar to talk about Polish attitude towards the BRI and what is going on in Poland when it comes to the BRI projects. Before I will touch upon the Polish case, let me very, very briefly say a few words about the Belt and Road Initiative as such, as it is a topic of today's meeting. Why I think it's important, because it's important to know what the BRI is, or what we mean by BRI. As you know, it's very nebulous or vague, or let's say flexible notion or initiative presented by Xi Jinping in 2013. It's flagship to some extent initiative by Xi Jinping, because it's a part of the Chinese Communist Party charter. It was introduced, this BRI, into the charter in 2017. And of course, sometimes everything is BRI, so it's difficult to say what's the BRI really means. But I think that we can, and I think it's for today's meeting, there is a kind of, let's say, traditional or classic understanding of Belt and Road Initiative, which is based on two elements: the infrastructure projects under the Chinese model on investments based on credit and loans. So the first element, the second one is connectivity. So and I think it is a topic of today's meeting. And to be frank, I think that the relevance or the significance of the role of this Belt and Road Initiative, understood as infrastructure projects as connectivity, role in Chinese politics of this element is decreasing. And why I think so? Because we can see that there is China's retreat from investment, overseas development in financing, and decrease in outbound investment from China. And there are many reasons for that. There are criticisms from Chinese society that China is spending money abroad. There is, of course, huge criticism globally. From Trump's administration, also the process of renegotiation of BRI investment deals. Of course, there are also kind of a change of approach in the EU, and also the kind of competition from other countries like Japan, India, or ASEAN countries. And there is a result. We can say that there is some kind of a restrictive access to overseas markets for Chinese companies. And of course now, because this process of decreasing role of the BRI is not a new one, phenomena started, I think, in 2018 So there is also some kind of a process that was strengthened in the last year, 2020, due to the pandemic, and China's focus on domestic market with a very well-known slogan of dual circulation. But of course, it doesn't mean that BRI is not important. Now is a process of recalibration, of redefinition of the BRI. We can see that for now, three elements, three new BRIs are important. They are health BRI, green BRI, and digital. So it's my very short explanation how I see the role of the BRI in Chinese politics. And now, because I have only 10 minutes now, probably 5, just few words about Polish stance, or where Poland is when it comes to the BRI. I think that there's a process of changing Polish approach to the BRI. And to be frank, it's not because of the BRI as an idea or initiative, but it is like let's say broader context, because there is a change of Polish approach towards China. A few years ago, we are pretty positive and enthusiastic about reinvigoration relations with China. In recent years, we are pretty critical, and more cautious when it comes to cooperation with China. So going strictly to the BRI, I think that we can talk about 2 periods when it comes to Polish attitude towards BRI. The first one, it was since the beginning of BRI, I mean 2013 till, let's say, 2017, it was positive, enthusiastic, and proactive approach. My understanding of that is that at that time, our perception of BRI is that it could be a means for expanding Polish exports to China, as we have a huge trade deficit, mean for attracting Chinese investment, also receiving some kind of Chinese money for infrastructural investment to catch up with our infrastructure, comparing with the Western Europe, speed up Poland's reindustrialization, and also there is a kind of ambition that Poland could be a Silk Road hub in CE countries. So it was the perception of BRI at the beginning, and we are very proactive. Poland signed BRI MOU in 2015. During Xi Jinping's visit to Warsaw in 2016, we upgraded our relations to comprehensive strategic partnership, and in this declaration, we introduced the slogan on Silk Road, and try to find some let's say overlapping elements with the Polish development plans. So it was a very proactive approach. There are many, let's say, seminars or summits about Silk Road during Xi Jinping's visit, also during visits of our officials in China. And in that moment, in this period, we were focused both on this connectivity element of BRI, but also in this infrastructure investments under Chinese investment model. Situation changed in 2017, more or less, and it is very paradoxically during visit of our Prime Minister in China when she attended the first International Belt and Road Forum in Beijing 2017, that we went to China with some kind of a message that we are not looking for Chinese money for some infrastructure projects, because we would like to have control over our investment on our soil, and of course we have access to the EU funds. So we would like to cooperate with China, but not in a sense that we will give China a land, for example, and ask China to build something, and that China has control over this investment. So it was I think a change of the approach since 2017, and it was a broader picture because we started to be more cautious about China because of many reasons. Let's say some hostile takeovers in Germany or in other countries by Chinese companies, Chinese interest in critical infrastructure, and so on. And since then, but it doesn't mean that we decided to be very, very critical or not to be engaged in the BRI idea. But now we are focusing mostly on the connectivity issues, not at this, let's say, element of the BRI, which is known as infrastructure projects under credit and loans from China. And what it means that we are that Poland mostly focuses on these connectivity issues. What we are trying to do is to let's say take advantage of our geographical location, the center of Europe, and mostly focus on connectivity. I mean the transport, which is connected with the cargo trains between China and Europe, and China and Poland, because there are some cargo train connections that go from China to Poland, and there is an end of the trip in Poland, but also many trains that pass Poland and go to the other European countries. So our goal is to increase transport cooperation to benefit from the cargo trains, also in the process of transshipment, because most of the products that are transported by cargo trains are pretty expensive. So the process of transshipment and delivering, for example, goods from trains that stop in Poland to other destination in Europe could be beneficial for us. And so we are trying to do is to build or modernize, enlarge the dry ports or logistic hubs in Poland. There are two very important places in Poland. One is on the border with Belarus. It's a Małaszewicze dry port. And the second one is a Sławków on the south in Poland. And the second one is important because we have their normal truck, let's say, the trains, but also the wide truck gauge, that it's easier to have this transport from Ukraine, for example. And what is very interesting, and I would like to finish my presentation, is that we are not looking for Chinese money for these projects, but we are using our own funds and EU funds to let's say enlarge or modernize this transshipment or dry hubs to be in that sense. Poland is trying to be engaged under the BRI framework. When it comes to the other, let's say, infrastructure projects or some kind of results from Belt and Road Initiative in the 7 or more than 7 years, there are many. There are not any flagship, let's say, BRI project that could be presented as a strictly project that we Poland and China cooperate, and we set up something infrastructure ones. So this is an overview of a Polish approach towards the BRI. I stop here. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Justina. And I think maybe in the Q&A session, we can dig a little bit on this new 3 BRI, the health and green and digital BRI. I think it would be interesting to talk about this. I see that we already received a few questions. I just want to ask and remind the audience that if you want to address a specific speaker, please write it down together with your question. Having said that, Carlos, please.
Okay, thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm very pleased to be here. And let me say thank you to the Istituto Affari Internazionale for this opportunity to share some thoughts on the Portuguese case concerning the Belt and Road Initiative. Having in mind the focus of this event, I would start by saying that in Portugal, it's hard to identify, to spot substantive impacts of the memorandum signed in December 2018 when President Xi visited our country. The answer to whether without the memorandum things would have evolved differently is most like no. meaning that we are talking about business as usual, meaning that the impact of the memorandum is really, it's not so visible, at least in the public realm. Trade levels are very much the same as it were before, although far from the FDI dynamics from the 2012, 2013, 2014, Chinese investors are still very interested in investing in Portugal. For instance, CCCC, the communications, what's the name of that? Communications and construction company, something like that, bought 30% of the biggest Portuguese construction company. So there are also still investment dynamics, but not so strong as they were before. And I'm thinking about Alibaba buying online fashion company, Portuguese company, and Huawei investing in solar energy in Portugal, as well in creating ICT academies in several Portuguese universities. So basically we are doing business as usual with China. And I think that all these dynamics are quite independent from the memorandum signed in the Belt and Road Initiative memorandum signed in December 2018. Let me say that in terms of the political relations between Portugal and China, there was a significant change in terms of the bilateral status, because in 2019, Portugal was basically hoisted by China to the status of, how can I say this, the status of strategic dialogue, meaning that the comprehensive partnership that we had since 2005 was in fact raised to the new status, and Portugal is now, alongside with Germany and France and Canada, special partner of China in terms of political dialogue. In practical terms, to be honest, I didn't notice much development stemming from this kind of evolution. Let me talk a little bit about the image of the Belt and Road Initiative in the country. And in fact, it's quite difficult to say something interesting about that, because if we take out of the picture the academics, or it's really hard to see somebody talking about the Belt and Road Initiative or whatever. We have a kind of association gathering the friends of the new Silk Road, and they discuss a lot, but it's a quite limited ranging group, meaning that the discussion is very, very weak in Portugal. So can we talk about changes deriving from the memorandum signed in December 2018? I would say yes. And I think that the main change is very much similar to what Justina was talking about. It's basically a variation in terms of enthusiasm. And let me explain. In 2017, 2016, 2018, and even during 2019, the Portuguese government did not hide its huge enthusiasm and expectation towards participation in the Belt and Road Initiative. Government members, including the Prime Minister, even the President, were very keen in showing their enthusiasm. about the Belt and Road Initiative. In fact, everybody was talking about the importance of the new Silk Road for Portugal, and both the Portuguese and the Chinese were somehow recognizing the port of Sines, one of our biggest maritime ports infrastructure, it is located in the southern part of Portugal, as the main driver, and I would say the major driver of the Portuguese role, or the potential Portuguese role in the Belt and Road Initiative. Lots of Chinese visiting the ports, lots of Portuguese selling or trying to sell the port in China. And in fact, there was a lot of buzz around the Port of Sines and the Belt and Road Initiative. But suddenly, this buzz simply vanished, at least in the public domain. And I think that this is a very important detail, I think. In fact, it was kind of given for granted that the Chinese would have strong participation in the Port of Sines sooner or later. But suddenly things changed. And in fact, what we have now, it's, I would say, a quite confusing stage, because the Portuguese government, for instance, invited Japanese companies to bid for the Port of Sines, or for the construction of a new container terminal in Sines. The Portugal External Trade Office was in fact negotiating with Taiwan-based high-tech companies in order to make them invest in the Sines special economic zone, which is somehow strange. And also the Americans are very interested, or they expressed their interest in the Port of Sines, because in fact, Sines is one of the main entry points of American natural gas in Europe. So the Americans are a little bit concerned with the possibility of having the Chinese, let's say, leading or managing the ports. I will conclude just to say that to me it seems obvious that American pressure, namely within the Huawei framework, although it was really assertively contested by the Portuguese authorities, but I think that the Americans' pressure was not strange to this change, in enthusiasm at least. As well as some EU criticism towards Portugal openness to China, and of course the new European positioning towards China was also has also played a part in this vanishing of enthusiasm. Nevertheless, let me just finish saying that next April we will have a much more clear picture about the positioning of Portugal in relation to the Belt and Road Initiative, because the bidding process concerning the Port of Sines, and the Port of Sines is, I would say, the pièce of résistance of the participation of Portugal in the Belt and Road Initiative. The bidding process will be concluded, so we'll know the results. And so we will be, let's say, equipped to say something more substantial about the positioning of Portugal in the Belt and Road Initiative. And I think that's, I will rest my case here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carlos. So Francesca Ghiretti from IAI, please.
I think if we had the possibility to hear about Greece as well before Italy, I think we would have, I would have said that probably we do share a lot of commonalities in these case studies. Mostly when you are to answer the question, has the BRI, as signing into the BRI had massive impact in your country? As Carlos said very well, it's like, well, not that much. Mostly is business as usual. Mostly is the fact that, you know, things that were supposed or were planned to be happening have happened, and not much more has happened. But I think that in the case of Italy, there is a bit of a peculiarity, just a little bit. The fact that the MOU, the memorandum, was signed in 2019, March 2019, and the plan was for 2020 to be the big year in which, you know, everything would have materialized. 2020 was also the 50th anniversary of the Italy-China diplomatic relations. It was going to be the year of tourism between Italy and China. Lots of events planned, lots of occasions to celebrate. And well, the year of tourism was then postponed to 2021. We'll see how that will go. And celebrations for the anniversary were toned down, basically. And that's because in 2020, as we're all very much aware, the pandemic hit all of us. So it's a bit difficult to make an assessment now of what it would have been without the pandemic of COVID-19. But I think that to a certain degree, we can make an assessment because certain variables would have been there in spite of the pandemic. And one of these is definitely the change of government. The fact that the government who signed the MOU, stopped to exist in September 2019. And one of the two coalition parties, that government was a populist party, one of the two coalition parties was replaced by a mainstream center-left coalition. Now, I don't know whether in a couple of days we'll have a new government, because now we're going through another government crisis. So I'm not quite sure whether, you know, after this talk we'll see a different development politically, but historically you have a center left that is quite positive towards China. The Five Star Movement also has a quite, you know, positive posture towards China. And then recently the right has taken a more skeptic approach. What I want to say today is basically just, even if we were to have a government led by the right, center right and right, I think, yeah, formally we would have a different positioning in terms of, you know, wording a message. I'm not quite sure whether in terms of content, actually something would change. And I think this is important to bear in mind for what I'm going to say next. And then the other element is exactly what Carlos said. Many things were planned well before March 2019, were in the pipelines well before March 2019. And, you know, some of them materialized after March 2019, but didn't necessarily came out of the agreement of the MOU. And some perhaps were helped by the MOU by the fact that it was a centralized framework that kind of formalized previous existing relationship. But if you look at like data in general, you see that, you know, for example, FDI have steadily increased. FDI from China to Italy in number, not amount, have steadily increased in the past years. We don't have the data for 2020. Probably in 2020, we would see a slight decrease, but that would be mainly due to the pandemic, because if it were due to a change of focus from the Chinese investors, then probably you would have already seen something in 2019 where that change of focus happened in the rest of the European Union. And in terms of trade, you know, usual, like other European countries, you have a growing trade deficit. Italy exports a lot less than it imports. So it's just, sorry, no, it's the opposite. Imports a lot less, a lot more than it exports. And on top of this, if you look at some of the, I don't want to call them flagship agreements because they're not, but if we want to carry on with the analysis on ports, the chapter on ports was particularly important, at least, you know, from the Italian debate side, will CCCC invest in Genoa and in Trieste? Well, we see now at the beginning of 2021, so almost 2 years after the agreement, that is very unlikely to happen. Other investors have stepped in Trieste, German investor notably, and in Genoa, the new investment, which was the, breakwater dam, actually the public bid went to, somebody else won the public bid. What happened in Genoa was the conclusion of the Vado Ligure terminal, but that was an agreement of 2013. So, and it was actually a new joint venture created between APM, Costco, and the city of Qingdao. So it's definitely not the result of the MOU itself. And other important chapters such as, space collaboration, that was scrapped very soon after the signing of the MOU. And other areas as well haven't quite developed as they hoped. For example, also in terms, to a certain degree, in terms of media collaboration, although not entirely. So looking at this, one would be, prone to say not much has happened since March 2019 between Italy and China. And, to a certain degree is true. From another point of view, if we look at 2020 for what 2020 was, which is a very particular year, we see that at the end of the day, actually quite a few agreements were concluded and developed between Italian and Chinese counterparts. Now, I'm not saying that this is because we signed the MOU, and I'm not saying that if we hadn't signed the MOU, then these just weren't possible. I'm just saying it happened in a year such as 2020. Some of these were part of the agreements within the MOU, others were extra. Some were important, for example, between the Italian Trade Agency and Chinese counterparts, such as Alibaba, or between SNAM and Pipe China. And honestly, that was the first international agreement collaboration made by PEP China. And in that agreement, it is SNAM that will collaborate with Pipe China in China. So from that point of view, it's a bit of a, point brought home, just these little victories. Of course, then one needs to understand that about 30% of SNAM is owned by CDP Reti, and 35% of CDP Reti is actually owned by State Grid Corporation of China. So there's a bit of, playing at home there. And I think the cherry on the top of the cake, it happened in the last weeks of December 2020, when everybody was very busy looking at how the agreement on investment at European level was going to go, and talking about whether, they were doing a great thing or not. The 10th session of the governmental commission of Italy and China was held, at the end of which there was an announcement made in which Wang Yi and Di Maio basically reiterated the commitment of Italy and China to developing the BRI agreements in 2021. And funnily enough, space collaboration was mentioned. And I don't know how much you were following or what I was saying, but space collaboration was one of the first things that was actually scrapped. So it's interesting that it was mentioned. It's not binding, of course, not at all. It's just words. It's just a communique at the end of a meeting. But it's interesting that it was there. And now I'll just conclude with some numbers, just to make you look that I have some solid data on which to rely, on which to base my analysis. In a poll that we made with IAI and the University of Siena, we asked people what they thought about Italian participation into the BRI. And 49% thought it was a great opportunity, and Italy was very much right to grasp such an opportunity. 19% thought that it was a great initiative to free Italy of the dependence from the US and the European Union, as if Italy wasn't part of the European Union. And then 32% had a bit of a more negative view. 20% thought that this was an attempt from China to colonize Italy economically and politically, and 12% thought it was a bit of a risky initiative and that it might alienate partners such as the United States and China. This is interesting to see that most of Italians do have a positive view of Italian foreign policy towards China, just to put it under a bigger framework. But as much like in Portugal, China is actually a very marginal topic in the Italian debate. Like public opinion is not particularly concerned with foreign policy in general, let alone something that is so far and so new as China. This is slightly changing now. There's a bit more attention and more newspapers and news outlets are covering China. But again, yeah, it's relevant to look at public opinion, but I don't know how much because of how Italian public opinion towards China works. And I think I'm gonna close it here. Thank you.
Thank you, Francesca. So let's move on with Plamen, and I think that we will talk even with him a lot about ports.
Yes, indeed. Indeed, Lorenzo. Thanks very much. I want to make a couple of introductory remarks, just like Justina did, about the very nature of the BRI concept or initiative. I think that its key feature is the lack of clarity, because 7.5 years after it was launched in September 2013, there's still no clear-cut definition of what constitutes a BRI project. And as a result of this, when you sign a BRI MOU, you're not quite clear on what exactly you are signing up to. Let me give you a couple of examples. There have been very many controversial projects along BRI routes, branded as BRI projects, but they've been controversial and predatory because they involve, say, the construction of casinos in Cambodia or Myanmar. And then, of course, the Chinese authorities are immediately trying to disavow these projects, telling the general public that, no, this is not the Belt and Road, this is something else. At the same time, there are 15 coal-fired plants in Vietnam built by Chinese contractors through the provision of Chinese loans. And these are obviously BRI projects. But Vietnam has not signed up to the BRI because of its conflict with China over the South China Sea and because of anti-Chinese sentiments running high in the country. So there's obviously a question mark over the nature of the BRI and the practical value of all these BRI MOUs and the way they're being used or possibly misused. I'm saying this because I will run quickly through Chinese investment projects in Greece, and I will try to answer the question to what extent they actually fit the BRI concept. To be precise, despite all the talk about Chinese investment in Greece, there are only 2 Chinese investment projects in Greece. There's the one in Piraeus, which is very much talked about, and the second one is by State Grid, China State Grid, which has purchased 24% stake in the high voltage transmission grid operator. Now, Piraeus, of course, and I know that everybody wants to hear about it. Let me tell you that there are 5 features of the Piraeus project that I'd like to dwell upon. First of all, despite the fact that it started back in 2008, way before the BRI was launched, very much like examples given by Francesca previously, the Piraeus one is indeed a BRI project. I would say it's the quintessence of the BRI. It's about connectivity, it's about transport, it's about infrastructure. Of course, it's a BRI project. Secondly, it is a true FDI project. Unlike very many BRI projects in, say, Asia, Africa, or the Western Balkans, it is not based on Chinese loans. It is based on Chinese money forked out by Costco and invested in the port of Piraeus. And this is to be acknowledged. Thirdly, the Piraeus project is quite successful in operational terms because Back in 2008, before Costco came, it had a very limited throughput, a very limited capacity to handle containers of about 700,000 TEU. In 2019, it went up to 5.6 million, which is an achievement in itself, and it's quite spectacular. And I would say that the fourth key feature of Piraeus is, of course, that for the Chinese, for Costco, it's an anchor investment in what appears to be a hub and spoke strategy, because from Piraeus, which is already the biggest port, the biggest container port in the Mediterranean, Chinese ships can then move goods around to other destinations, other ports in the Mediterranean basin, and of course towards either North Africa or Europe. But, and this is the big but, and this is the fifth feature of Piraeus, the Costco investment has not been free of controversy. Far from it. In fact, it's been riddled with problems, and they're now coming to the surface. Let me tell you that today, as we speak, there's a strike in Piraeus. It started yesterday when 25 ships were queuing up outside Piraeus, unable to enter the port. And this is just one of the signs of problems, you know, piling up in Piraeus, because there are very many concerns voiced by different stakeholders. It's a motley crew, I would say, of conflicting local interests. But right now, all these local stakeholders have formed a broad alliance against Costco. I wouldn't put all the blame on the Chinese side, because we must admit that there's quite a bit of red tape on the Greek side, or some vested interest as well. But it is a fact that Costco have been unable to acknowledge the agency of local actors, local stakeholders. And it's also true that Costco's approach has been too heavy-handed, and they have failed, you know, to take local stakeholders on board. The second investment in the high voltage grid operator started back in 2016 as a portfolio investment. And it is only recently that it started producing some results. The Chinese state grid, that is, are involved in the construction of an underwater cable, electricity cable towards Crete and some islands, non-connected islands in the central Aegean archipelago. Now, these are the two investments, Chinese investments in Greece. And there's a much longer list of aborted or failed Chinese investment projects that nobody speaks about. And I think it's interesting because they will tell you a story. Let me quickly run through them. Back in 2016, Costco were interested in the construction of a rail freight terminal near Piraeus. That failed. That would have been the BRI project, all right. In 2016, again, Costco were expected to bid for the acquisition of the railway operator, the national railway operator. Eventually, they didn't. We could discuss this through the QA. But interestingly, the Italians actually took over the national railway network of Greece. And again, that would have been the BRI project. The Chinese Machinery Engineering Corporation was interested in investing in lignite power plants in northwestern Greece. Eventually, Greece's policy changed. So these plans were dropped, aborted. Again, that might have qualified as a BRI project. Interestingly, a Chinese company wanted to get hold of Greece's biggest insurer, an insurance company, but in the end, the negotiations with the Chinese were severed quite unceremoniously. Of course, that has nothing to do with the BRI. There are several projects by private and state-owned Chinese companies investing in jewelry makers, nothing to do with the BRI. Property development, nothing to do with the BRI. Interestingly, last week, State Grid and yet another Chinese company were disqualified from a tender, a public tender, for the mid and low voltage grid operator. It's a very interesting case. We could discuss it through the QA if you're interested, but it provides some very interesting legal arguments, and this could well become a legal precedent to be discussed across Europe. In terms of investment, there's of course a lot of Chinese citizens investing in golden visas, of course buying property in Greece, but obviously this is not a BRI activity. And there's shipping, of course. Shipping, as you can imagine, the vast commercial fleet of Greece has always been on very good terms with China, which is their biggest customer, which is quite understandable. Back in 2010, the former Chinese Premier Wen Jiabao was in Athens and announced a loan facility to Greek ship owners so that they could construct their ships in Chinese shipyards. But again, that could qualify as a BRI area of cooperation, but that was announced before the BRI in 2013. On trade and what, I could say that yes, the ratio of imports and exports between Greece and China has become better, it has improved, but not because of the BRI, basically because of the crisis in Greece for more than 10 years. Chinese imports into Greece have diminished, and this is why the ratio has now come down to 4:1. It used to be 10:1 in favor of China, it's now come down to 4:1. Very briefly, because I know that I'm running out of time, on whether the BRI has affected political relations between Greece and China, I would say that under the previous government, you know that Greece made a lot of goodwill political gestures to China, but that had nothing to do with the BRI. It's because the previous government was very radical, I would say very anti-Western. They were looking for political allies somewhere, well, elsewhere, but not in the West. So they would reach out to Russia, China, of course, Iran, and even Venezuela, of all countries. But that had nothing to do with the BRI. But the result of this, that although there has been a change of government in Greece, this country is still struggling, to convince Western partners that it is not China's Trojan horse or fifth column in Europe. On the image of the BRI, I would say that, first of all, there are relatively few references to the BRI. Secondly, it is not called BRI. It doesn't translate nicely in Greek. The standard phrase in Greece is the Silk Road, because that relates to history. Greeks can relate to that because it has to do with Alexander the Great's expedition to Asia back in the 4th century BC. And of course, it's very close to their heart. But that's about it. I want to emulate Francesca's show off, and let me also come up with some figures so that I look a solid researcher. Let me tell you that right now we have an ongoing media monitoring exercise in Greece. We are monitoring a sample of Greek media outlets in order to see how China is portrayed there. And I can tell you that 1 out of 5 articles in the media, in those media outlets, refers to Piraeus. Piraeus is the biggest topic, of course. When it comes to cultural ties, because this is something that the Chinese very actively promote, they promote the idea of a cultural kinship and fraternity between Greece and China because of their ancient civilizations. Interestingly, out of what comes out of our sample is that cultural ties, references to cultural ties between Greece and China, account to 1.4%. Not really impressive. It looks like there is no massive demand for cultural cooperation between Greece and China. 3 conclusions, and I'll be done. The first point is that Greece clearly sits on the maritime Silk Road. Of course, Piraeus is very much a BRI project, and shipping is a big part of economic cooperation between Greece and China. Secondly, Greece is not gaining as much as it wants to as much as it expected. And thirdly, the BRI discourse is infinitely more important to China than to Greece. If Greece is to be taken on board, then the whole BRI discourse and strategy should be revisited so that it could become more meaningful to Greece. Thanks for your patience. I'll stop at this and we'll be happy to take questions.
Thank you, Vlamen. Well, I mean, I have to say that there are a lot of things to discuss, and I think that before opening the floor to question from the audience, I think that I would like to give the speakers the chance to raise some question or to make some comments. Anyone wants to, please, Justina.
Thank you very much. I would like to ask a question to ask Francesca about the BRI MOU that Italy signed with China, because I remember there's a huge topic in Europe that Italy decided to sign this MOU, and of course Poland signed with China in 2015, but till now this MOU is not publicly available. To be honest, I found it on the Chinese website somewhere in Chinese language, but generally speaking, but it's difficult to find out what is inside. So I'd like to ask if you could just tell us a little bit what is inside this MOU, because to be honest, from my understanding, I'm not sure why we are so worried about MOU, which is not legal binding. It's a kind of a declaration. I know that is a kind of a signal that we are interested in the Belt and Road Initiative, but I think that countries that signed this BRI MOU are perceived as that they are like very much this idea that they are so close cooperation with China under this slogan. So I would like to ask you about the content, if you could tell us a few words about the content of a MOU that Italy signed with China.
The content was public, so we got to see the text, the communique and everything. And we also have a clear, graph of the 29 agreements that have been signed. 20 are institutional and 9 are commercial. And this is usually what we use as sort of a starting base to assess at what point are we. But again, if you look at the content, at the single agreements, and you put them against what the BRI is in terms of, connectivity, basically there's not much in that terms. Most of these agreements do go to different type of sectors, such as financial sectors, such as, collaboration in a rather broad sense. And the institutional one, for example, some are about tourism, some are about the, I don't know how to say this, basically giving back some of the art that was stolen from China historically, so give it back to China. And then a part of it is about university, collaboration between universities. I'm trying to remember everything, but there is is available online. Again, none of this is strictly binding. Again, this is an expression of intent, and it is a little bit more precise. And I think it is a little bit more precise because the BRI negotiations between Italy and China had been going on for a few years. And allegedly, initially, the intent was to sign smaller bilateral agreements rather than signing up to the BRI. And this is probably why there were, already smaller agreements made. And at the same time, the actors that were brought into signing these agreements, most of them have, as I told you, were already active in having partnership and collaborations with China. What I want to say is that there was an effort at national level to identify the sectors of interest for Italy, both in terms of outgoing, so which sectors would like to be more active in China, and both which sectors would like to receive more investments from China. Practical example is the fact that Italy is an economy based on small and medium enterprises. So every time you try to penetrate the Chinese market to do business in China is quite complicated because of the size of these enterprises. And there was an attempt to create sort of, you know, conglomerate or consortium that would then export the same type of good, for example, wine, together in order to make this more effective. And instead of this, what happened is we signed this year in 2020 a few agreements for the creation of online business-to-business platform with a series of Chinese and Italian partners who have created this platform for Italian business to have relationship with Chinese business and then sell the products. Yeah, this is to give you like a broad overview. I hope it was a good answer. To Plamen, I would like to know more about the exclusion from public tender of state grid of China and the other Chinese enterprise, just because I would like to know the reasons for exclusion. Because, for example, in Italian public tender, they usually use subsidies, and what we saw is that when they use these subsidies, they usually are not quite successful in winning the public tenders in the first place.
So let's do it this way. Plamen, I'm gonna stop you and read a couple of questions from the audience. So you will have time to gather some information and prepare your answer. And also leave the others with some time to prepare their answer. So we have a question from Enrico Fardella. How do you picture the future of the BRI in light of a dual circulation strategy and Biden's almost new China policy? This is the first question. Of course, you can read it also in the Q&A chat. And there's another question which was very interesting from Andrea Malena, and it's directed to everyone. And it says, within the BRI framework, is there any room for conditionality to trade in EU's ends? For instance, the respect of human rights or solution to the Uyghur issue. Is there any chance of coordination among EU member states in these regards? So please, Plamen, if you want to start answering maybe Francesca's question, and then I will open the floor to the other speakers.
To Francesca's question, the exclusion, the disqualification of two Chinese companies from the tender for the partial privatization of the mid and low voltage operator has a very interesting legal argument at its core. State Grid is already a shareholder to the extent of 24% in the high voltage grid operator. And it's now bidding to get into the share capital of the mid and low voltage operator. The argument there was that this would constitute a conflict of interest because it would give State Grid a dominant position, if not a monopolistic position in the electricity market. The second argument is even more interesting because the second Chinese bidder, a company called South Power Grid, has nothing to do with anything in Greece. It's the first time it appears in Greece, but it's also a state-owned company. And the legal argument is that if South Power Grid took over or bought shares in the mid and low voltage operator, then the two Chinese companies could actually play together because they have the same parent, which is the Chinese state. You understand the implications of this legal argument if it's taken across Europe. What that could possibly mean each time Chinese state-owned companies take part in tenders. To Enrico's question on dual circulation, Biden's China policy and the BRI, I think that regardless of Biden, and it may take a while before we see his China policy unfold, I think that the BRI is changing one way or another. It started changing even back in 2018 or 19, before the outbreak of COVID-19, because of its own flaws. I would call them design flaws. And then, of course, the pandemic affected China's image quite negatively. It also affected the capacity of host countries to pay loans back. And now the Chinese banks, mostly Chinese policy banks, have become a lot more cautious before they give loans to other countries. I would say that Biden's China policy and the dual circulation strategy, which is still on paper, have nothing to do with the BRI and its own design flaws. I don't quite understand. I'm not sure I got the question about the BRI and human rights, but I've got an interesting question in the chat coming from Mr. Vernikos, and I think he's got a point. I think he says that trouble in Piraeus does not directly relate to, the management of the port, but the fact that COSCO has been trying to expand into other areas of business activities, like ship repair, and that's true. It's one of the reasons why there's so much friction in Piraeus right now. COSCO are being accused of expanding way too much, way beyond the bounds set by the 2008 and 2016 contracts, which is true.
Anyone wants to comment or reply to previous questions? Please, Justina.
Okay, thank you very much. I would like to follow the response that about this dual circulation and connection with the Belt and Road Initiative. I think that there is a connection between possible about the prospects of Belt and Road Initiative and dual circulation, because if we are talking about BRI as some infrastructure projects or some Chinese investment abroad, I think that dual circulation, if this slogan will be implemented, I think that could be decrease of Chinese investment abroad, because dual circulation means that the most important issue is a domestic, focus on domestic issues. Of course, China is not going to close herself, but domestic dimension is more important than this external one. And what it could be an impact on the Belt and Road Initiative is that under this framework of dual circulation, the most important thing is Chinese, let's say, focus on high tech or some innovations. And in that sense, to some extent, China could recalibrate the Belt and Road Initiative from infrastructure investment of orders on this, let's say, digital or cyber element of the BRI, just to promote its, let's say, ZTE, Huawei, etc., in those countries that they could cooperate with China on this basis. So I think in this respect, we can say that it could be an impact on the BRI. So not less Chinese, let's say, old type of investment abroad, but more focus on this digital or cyber dimension of the Belt and Road Initiative.
Thank you.
May I say something?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, sorry. Thanks. I think that it would be an error to neglect, I'm going to use the term symbolic power of the Belt and Road Initiative, or as we prefer in Portugal, as in Greece, the new Silk Road. Because in fact, namely in its dimensions of the green, the health and the digital, I think that China is and will be a crucial partner for Europe. And I think that the success of Europe in developing, let's say, growth and development trajectories, namely based on health, on green and the digital dimensions would suffer if we put aside China. And this relates to the Biden question, because I think that it would be good to see Biden changing the black and white positioning that was basically supporting the US position towards the relationships between European countries and China. Basically, for instance, in the case of Portugal, what was on the table was, if you are friendly to China, you cannot be friendly to the US. And this has huge consequences, of course, because Portugal is a member of NATO. Portugal is very much keen in maintaining very good relations with the US. And so this is a very, I would say, unproductive positioning. And I hope the US change its stance towards this. Because I think that the US is, of course, a crucial player also in, but I have strong problems in seeing Europe succeeding by looking only to the transatlantic relationship and neglecting China. Let's hope for a much more peaceful relationship between the US and China in order to allow Europe to develop in a more, say, productive way.
Excuse me, may I have one sentence about this conditionality about trade? Because I'm not sure if I understood correctly the question, but if so, the question probably was if there is a possibility to introduce some conditionality with having trade relations with China. To be honest, it's completely, and for me, it's difficult to imagine, as the trade is done by private companies which are based on earning money. So I could not imagine that we could just to make some conditionality in trade and focusing on human rights and so on. Of course, now we are talking very many being speakers in this kind of panels or the seminars. We are mostly talking about the country's approach, the authorities' approach, but we should pay attention to the fact that trade is done by private companies. So for me, it's difficult to imagine that this conditionality could be imaginable.
Thank you, Justina. I have a question from Michele Casadei. He asks if the digital BRI mentioned by Justina played some kind of role in the mask diplomacy. And also we have another question from Luigi Zunarelli. Luigi Zunarelli asks is it possible that, at least for Italy, so maybe Francesca, you want to take this one, the signature of the MOU and the US-EU reaction raised an even higher international concern, and it had actually a negative impact on Chinese ODI in the country instead of facilitating them?
No, I don't think it had a negative impact on the income of direct investments or investments in general, to be honest. There was definitely a role played by the debate at European and transatlantic level in certain aspects of the MOU, the ports, the space, collaboration, technology and science, and the media as well. There was a role that was played, and in those aspects, they did play the role of brake. But if we speak about negative impact, generally speaking, the inflow of investments, then no, I would say no. And to Michele Casadei, to whom I say hi, I'm actually going to say very quickly, because he mentioned the Xinhua-ANSA partnership, and there you have seen the results of the agreement. There has been a massive increase in coverage of news regarding China. These news are directly translated from Xinhua, where they are in Chinese, to Italian, and you see them on ANSA. They're labeled as Xinhua, but of course, you know, if you are the regular reader, perhaps you don't even know what that, you know, really means, to be honest. So there, yes, there we saw an impact and we saw an increase, but in terms of mask diplomacy, I think what really was a game changer in terms of attention in Italy was the fact that the foreign minister, Di Maio, was there and broadcasting live the arrival of the first medical supplies. I think that played a much bigger role than any agreement signed between Xinhua and ANSA.
Thank you, Francesca. Anyone wants to say something about the mask diplomacy or the role that, that maybe the digital Belt and Road Initiative, even though, I mean, we know that maybe it's not too much linked to the flow of information.
If I may, Lorenzo.
Yes, please.
A very brief remark. First of all, the Digital Silk Road, DSR, as it is known, is still very much work in progress. And I would say that it is in its early days, right? It's a proposal, it's a concept. I don't think that we're there yet. Although, of course, the Chinese promote this idea. To what extent that relates to the mask diplomacy? Well, to the extent that Huawei and ZTE, the two most prominent Chinese companies represented in Europe, made sure that they donated some masks last year. But of course, that was more of a PR campaign rather than something in the framework of the Digital Silk Road. Okay, we know that they are after contracts now that the 5G rollout is taking off in very many European countries, but I'm not sure that relates to the Digital Silk Road. Let me tell you that last year, our European think tank network on China, ETNC, produced a report on the way the COVID-19 pandemic affected relations between Europe and China. And in fact, all of us were involved in that effort. And I take the opportunity to inform the audience that this report is available, and I think it's still pretty much up to date.
Thank you, Plamen.
Yeah,
Carlos,
let
me
say something about the mask diplomacy, because in Portugal it was a big deal in the beginning of pandemic surge, namely in March and April. And in fact, there was a sensation that the European Union has had abandoned the country, and the Chinese were taking the place of the EU there. But things changed very quickly around May. And I think that the discourse on the Chinese virus did play a role there. And together with this, I think that let's say the repositioning of the European Union towards the provision of medical supplies and was also important, because in fact the European Union started to pour money and other resources into Portugal, and I think that it happened the same in Greece and Italy, and so this changed the game. But during March and April, the Chinese were were replacing Europe according to the overall perception of Portuguese people. So let me just say, this is important to show that, in fact, apparently small things can play a very important role in international relations.
Thank you, Carlos. And I have a question from Marina Liberi. Marina asks, does the BRI play a mitigating role within the EU and member states, or does it exacerbate the different foreign policy lines among them? This is a very interesting question, and I think that it would be even more interesting to know more, I mean, your position on this. Anyone wants to reply? Please, Francesca.
I'm going to say the obvious thing, so the other people perhaps have some more interesting point of view. I think that any framework, and here I'm going to hint at something, any framework that divides the European Union into subgroups, of course, creates divisions, at least formally. And the fact that a framework like the BRI is so politically and geopolitically charged means that, of course, these divisions are even more relevant. And we've seen this. I mean, we've seen this. Italy was very heavily criticized by Germany and France just because it joined the BRI. And then if you look at data, you see that France and Germany have much closer relationship with China than Italy does. But, you know, I do think that something so contentious as the BRI exacerbates the divisions between in between the European Union. So I said the obvious thing.
If I may, to be honest, I think that is another initiative or framework that is perceived as a more divisive, that the BRI is 17+1 formula. So I think that BRI is not as bad as 17+1 seen from the Western European perspective. But yes, I agree that there was, because I remember this debate about Italy signing BRI MOU, the huge debate. And I remember this moment when Poland signed this MOU, but it was 2015. It was completely different story, different moment. So at that time, it was not very controversial. I think it was the beginning of this Belt and Road Initiative. Also the debate in China, what it is. But I agree that especially in 2019, when Italy was preparing for signing, it was perceived as a tool for dividing EU, but also another formula, China-led formula 17+1 is also a tool to divide EU member states.
Any comments from Plamen or Carlos?
Just a very short one. It's an opportunity to talk a little bit about the content of the Memorandum of Understanding. And in fact, the document is not public, but I hope the 270 or 80 people here do not tell the secret to anybody, but I managed to to get it. So I know the content. And concerning the question about divisive dynamics in Europe regarding China, there is, according to my opinion and to my reading of the documents, there is something very interesting from this point of view, because every initiative is, how can I say this, is framed by the European membership of Portugal, meaning that the European Union membership is something that is, I would say, transversal to all initiatives written down on the document, meaning that there was a huge concern in keeping the European Union as a reference in terms of the relationship between Portugal and China, at least on paper. Then I don't know. But I think that this is a very interesting feature of the MOU, and somehow indicates that at least Portugal doesn't want to contribute for this division in Europe.
If I may, Lorenzo.
Sure, please.
Yeah, I've got a question in the chat, something to do with the Western Balkans and the railway track between Piraeus and Budapest, and to what extent the Prespa agreement between Greece and North Macedonia could facilitate this process. I think that in principle, yes, political relations between Greece and North Macedonia have improved a lot, but I think that the key challenges ahead have to do with the infrastructure itself, the railway track, which is there, but it needs to be upgraded. And that calls for a lot of funding, of course, and I would say standards. Because we have very different standards in Greece, North Macedonia, Serbia, and Hungary. Greece and Hungary are EU member states, although Hungarians do not seem to remember that every day, and they have now passed a law on the Hungarian section of the Belgrade-Budapest railway track. The law has been classified for 10 years, which is totally unthinkable by EU standards. Serbs proceed with their own arrangement with the Chinese. North Macedonians are very cautious because they've had a negative experience with Chinese contractors, and Greece has its own predicaments. So I would say the key challenge for the upgrading of this transport corridor between Piraeus and Budapest appears to be primarily technical and financial.
Thank you, Plamen. So thanks to all the panelists, and I really want to thank also all the people who attended the webinar, because I mean we had an incredible number in the audience. So thank all of you and have a great evening.